Welcome to SST8's series on evidence-based instructional strategies. This webinar is one in our series of webinars on evidence-based instructional strategies. The intent of these webinars is for teacher-based teams, individual teachers, or building level teams to view and discuss this content and provide flexibility in meeting your professional development needs. For example, you may choose to chunk the content and break it up over multiple days, or you may wish to use it as part of a professional development day. This webinar focuses on the topic of direct instruction. Direct instruction is an effective, evidence-based approach for teaching and learning that, when used at the right time with the right content, has been found to accelerate student learning. For today's webinar, we have 3 learning intentions. Our content learning intention is that you will be able to explicitly define the 7 steps of direct instruction. The language learning intention is that you will reflect on, discuss, and share new thinking around the 7 steps of direct instruction. And for our social learning intention, you will participate in conversations and collaborate with team members to increase your impact on student learning using direct instruction. Much of the information in this session comes from the visible learning research from John Hattie. This is just a sampling of the information and research that can be found around direct instruction. A special thank you to Missouri Educational Systems and Instruction for Learning for their in-depth research and information around this topic as well.
Before we dig into the specifics around direct instruction, let's talk a little bit about the research. When we discuss John Hattie's work around visible learning, conversations generally focus on effect sizes. In his research, John has found that the average effect size over all effects that he has studied is 0.4. Hattie considers the 0.4 effect size to be a marker that represented a year's growth per year of schooling for a student. Anything above 0.4 would have a greater positive effect on student learning, hence his idea of a hinge point. Aside from effect size, there is a consideration around when a strategy will work best in terms of student learning. What strategy and when to use the strategy are equally important when thinking about the impact on student learning. Selecting a strategy is not as simple as looking at a list and choosing the strategy with the highest effect size. At this time, pause the webinar, read the slide, and share your thoughts with your team. When you are ready to continue, resume the webinar. Let's talk about the 3 different types of learning: surface, deep, and transfer. According to Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry, surface learning refers to building foundational knowledge such as concepts, skills, and strategies. Deep learning is consolidating foundational knowledge to be able to apply and extend students' own learning to develop a deeper understanding. And transfer learning is the point where students take all of their knowledge and understanding and apply it in new and different contexts. You may choose to pause here and discuss or continue on with the webinar.
In this session, our focus is on the surface learning strategy of direct instruction. According to John Hattie's most recently updated meta-analyses from July of 2019, direct instruction has an effect size of 0.59. Direct instruction is a surface learning strategy that refers to instructional approaches that are structured, sequenced, and led by teachers. Direct instruction requires teachers to have clear learning intentions and success criteria, build a commitment and engagement among the students in the learning task, use modeling and checking for understanding in their teaching, and engage in guided practice so that every student can demonstrate his or her grasp of new learning by working through an activity. Missouri Educational Systems and Instruction for Learning is an online source of professional development materials and resources. On the slide, you will see the poster that was collaboratively developed to give a description of direct instruction. Notice there are 7 explicit steps in direct instruction. Steps 1 and 2 are developing clear intentions with success criteria. Step 3 is the hook, where you build that commitment and engagement. Step 4, presentation, is where the teacher models and checks for understanding. Engaging in guided practice is step 5. Students summarize and connect learning during step 6, wrap up and closure. And finally, step 7 is where students demonstrate a grasp of their new learning through independent practice. Why direct instruction? Well, when using direct instruction as the framework for planning, the teacher increases his or her effectiveness by considering the 7 elements as they bring alive the content or as they scaffold the learning needs of the student. Teacher decision-making is the basis of this approach to teaching. Adams and Engelman made a useful connection between direct instruction and acceleration of student learning, as the principal objective of direct instruction is to provide instruction to accelerate the performance of students. That is, teach more in less clock time. Aim at teaching generalizations beyond rote learning, sequence learning, and constantly monitor the performance of students as they move to achieve their challenging goals.
As previously stated and first outlined by Adams and Engelman, direct instruction involves 7 major steps. Let's take a closer look at each of the 7 steps. Step 1 is determine learning intentions. When we talk about learning intentions, we need to think about how teachers ensure that they have a clear idea of what students should be able to do, understand, care about as a result of the teaching, prior to actually teaching the lesson. Teacher teams should have conversations to gain clarity of the standard, including the level of rigor of the standard and what success should look like. An additional consideration during step 1 is how will students be informed of the learning intentions. Creating learning intentions using student-friendly language will be a key component of team conversations during this step. When creating learning intentions, it is important to remember to help students grasp an understanding of their goal for the day by using student-friendly language. Let's take a look at a 6th grade ELA example. Given the standard, what might be specific learning intentions that the teacher or TBT has identified? This is the important conversation that happens when TBTs unpack standards to help determine the specific learning goals for students. When unpacking a standard, team conversations might also include identifying sub-skills that students will need to reach mastery of the standard. Here is an example of possible learning intentions an ELA team may have identified for this specific lesson after unpacking the standard. Notice that they are written in a way that students will be able to understand and reflect on at the end of the lesson. In order to cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text, students should find and document the author, title, and publishing information about the resources. They should support their thinking, opinions, arguments with evidence from the text, and discover what the author says directly and indirectly by using clues to find meanings. At this time, pause the video, think about your answers to these questions, and share your thoughts with your team. When you're ready, resume the webinar.
The next step in direct instruction is to create success criteria. During this step, teacher teams will ask, what specifically will success look like? There are 2 considerations. 1, when and what will students be held accountable for from the lesson or activity? And 2, how will the students be informed about the standards or expectations of performance? Once again, student-friendly language will be an important consideration during this step. A few examples of how to inform students of success criteria include using scoring guides and 2- and 3-point rubrics. When introducing scoring guides and rubrics to students, it is helpful to show student exemplars. One consideration when deciding on the number of categories to include in scoring guides and rubrics would be the lack of a bottom or a zero category. Another example of student success criteria would be to use exemplars and provide clarity around expectations of student work. At this time, read the 3 questions, and as a team, choose one of the questions to discuss. Pause the video and resume after your discussion. Two powerful ways of increasing impact is to know and share both the learning intentions and success criteria of the lesson with students. When students know both, they are more likely to work towards mastering the criteria of success, more likely to know where they are on the trajectory towards the success, and more likely to have a good chance of learning how to monitor and self-regulate their process. If you and your team are interested in seeing an example of a teacher modeling learning intentions and success criteria, check out the video link on the Direct Instruction resource document. After watching the video, you may wish to discuss with your team your thoughts around learning intentions and success criteria. You may choose to do this now or at another time.
The third step in direct instruction is build commitment and engagement, also known as the hook. This is the part of direct instruction where you grab students' attention and build excitement for what is to come. The purpose of the hook is to focus student attention on the lesson and is the point in the lesson where you might want to share the learning intentions and success criteria. When thinking about hooking your students, teams might ask, what would activate prior knowledge, grab their attention, put students in a receptive frame of mind, and or help students to internalize the learning intentions? How can you get the students to think about how the learning will be personal and relevant to them? What might speak to them? When setting up a math or social studies lesson on modeling with proportions or carbon footprints, one example of a hook could be a picture or video of a turtle having a straw pulled from its nose due to the vast number of straws that end up in landfills, lakes, rivers, and oceans. What would students be interested in learning? Could they determine how many straws are used every day across the country and throughout the world, every month, every year? How many miles would the straws stretch if they were laid end to end? How much would they weigh in pounds, in tons? How many end up in the ocean? And what does this do to the ocean wildlife? How many straws does a single person throw away in 1 year, in their lifetime? Start a unit on conservation, carbon footprints, recycling. Think about it. Middle school students showing a picture or a video of a straw being pulled out of a turtle's nose. Would they be interested in discovering or learning more? I think they might. In thinking of a virtual learning environment, which of the examples listed on the slide would be easy for you to implement? A video could be a YouTube link in Google Classroom. An anticipation guide could be done in Kahoot. A pre-reading where students could choose one of 3 articles or websites to look at prior to the lesson and come to the lesson with 3 important ideas from their reading. At this time, talk with your team right now as to how you might integrate the idea of a hook into a virtual learning environment. If you're interested in seeing an example of a hook, refer to your Evidence-Based Strategies Direct Instruction resource document to watch a 26-second video to get students excited to learn about soil. An additional example of a hook is an anticipation guide. Not only do you find out what the students know prior to teaching the lesson, but it can also help students to find ideas and information that they'll be interested in learning more about. At this time, read through the 3 questions and think about your answers in terms of a traditional classroom and a virtual learning environment. Pause the webinar and share your ideas with your team.
The 4th step in direct instruction is present the lesson. Let's take a closer look. When presenting the lesson, there are 3 considerations. 1, input. How will information be provided for students to gain the knowledge or skill? Lecture, film, video, pictures, etc. 2, modeling. The teacher shows students examples of what is expected as an end product in which critical aspects are explained through labeling, categorizing, and comparing to exemplars. And 3, check for understanding. How will the teachers monitor whether the students have got it before proceeding? Students must practice doing it right. If there is any doubt, the concept or skill must be retaught before independent practice begins. These 3 considerations are important in a virtual environment as well. What could these look like in a virtual classroom? What might you do differently? Let's take a few minutes to think specifically about how you might check for understanding. Perhaps you utilize Google Chat in breakout or meet rooms and encourage student discourse. The next slide talks a little more about checking for understanding. When thinking about checking for understanding, here are some common methods that many of you currently use in your traditional classrooms. How might these be adapted for virtual learning? Formative assessments using FIS to 5, whiteboards, bell ringers, observations, clickers, exit and entrance tickets, and response cards are just a few examples. What are other ways to check for understanding? Pause the video and discuss. Resume when you and your team are ready to move on. If you and/or your team are interested in seeing an example of a teacher modeling multiple ways to check for understanding with her students, check out the video link on the direct instruction resource document. At this time, pause the video, think about your answers to the questions on the slide, and share your thoughts with your team. Resume the webinar when you and your team are ready to continue.
Continuing on, step 5 in direct instruction is provide guided practice. Guided practice involves an opportunity for each student to demonstrate his or her grasp of new learning by working through an activity or exercise under the teacher's direct supervision. This is the key, under the teacher's direct supervision. During this time, the teacher moves around the room to determine the level of mastery and to provide feedback and individual remediation as needed. This is where we can correct mistakes and flesh out misunderstandings prior to students moving on to work on their own. Making mistakes under the supervision of the teacher allows immediate correction instead of students practicing incorrectly for an extended period of time where unlearning will need to occur. At this time, take a few minutes to reflect on these questions and choose 1 or 2 questions to discuss with your team, including how you plan to provide guided practice in a virtual environment. Pause the webinar to have this conversation and resume when you are ready to move on.
Closure of the lesson is step 6 in direct instruction. Let's take a deeper look. Closure involves reviewing and clarifying the key points of a lesson, tying them all together into a coherent whole, and ensuring that they will be applied by the student. Closure should help students bring things together in their own minds, make sense out of what has just been taught, help them to know that they have arrived at an important point in the lesson, to help them organize their learning, form a coherent picture, consolidate information and eliminate confusion and frustration, and reinforce the major points learned. Any questions? No? Okay, let's move on. Is not an example of closure. Some examples of closure include summarizing learning intentions or goals and success criteria, completing journal entries or a reflection, summarizing the content, additional formative assessments, and possibly student discourse or class discussion. One example might be the World Cafe protocol shown on the slide. In thinking about these examples of closure, how might you adapt and integrate closure activities you have used in a traditional classroom to a virtual learning environment? Take some time now to reflect as a team about closure of the lesson. Pause the video and resume when you are ready to move to the final step of direct instruction.
The final step in direct instruction is to provide independent practice for students. Independent practice is provided on a repeating schedule so that the learning is not forgotten. It may be homework or group and individual work in class, or it may provide for decontextualization, meaning that there are enough different contexts of practice provided so that the skill or concept may be applied to any relevant situation and not just the context in which it was originally learned. This is why the guided practice step is key. Students must have a solid understanding of the content or skill in order to be able to apply their learning in a new way. For example, if during guided practice, a student is practicing inferencing using a passage about dinosaurs, during independent practice, the student should be able to read a passage about another topic, such as whales, and be able to make inferences. The skill that the student is practicing remains the same, but the passage may differ. Questions to consider include, how does independent practice relate to the learning intention and standard? Are all aspects of teaching, learning, and practice aligned to the standard or skill targeted for the day? The advocates of direct instruction argue that the failure to do the 7th step is responsible for most student failure to be able to apply something learned. As you look at the examples of independent practice listed on the slide, what have you discovered works best in a traditional classroom? What about in a virtual learning environment? At this time, read the questions on the slide and discuss ways to integrate independent practice in different learning environments. Pause to have your discussion and come back when you're ready.
Let's consider this graphic one more time. We do these steps at some point during a lesson when we are delivering instruction. However, which step might you want to be more intentional in planning for to impact student learning? Would you use direct instruction for the entire lesson? Or could it be for a lesson within the lesson? How could this work during small group instruction within a lesson? Or during station rotations? What else are you thinking right now? Pause the webinar one more time to share out your thoughts. When thinking about different learning environments, whether it is traditional or virtual, when a teacher or a team intentionally chooses direct instruction as an instructional strategy to implement, the teacher or team determines the learning intentions and success criteria and makes them transparent to the students, demonstrates by modeling, and then evaluates to make sure that the students have the correct information by checking for understanding and taking immediate action to adjust or adapt instruction for those students who have demonstrated a lack of understanding. And then tying all of the learning together with closure before students independently practice. In summary, direct instruction is intentional, well-planned, and student-centered. Keeping these 3 ideas in mind as you plan for instruction will help to increase the impact of learning for your students. As we come to a close, here are a few questions that you and your team can use to reflect upon your own learning. During this webinar, what is one thing you have learned or changed your mind about? What is one thing you want to remember? And what is one thing you will change or implement moving forward? Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen. For additional information on instructional strategies, please visit our website, www.sst8.org/school improvement, or check out our School Improvement playlist on our State Support Team 8 YouTube channel.